A pilot's word is law at 30,000 feet. His authority is absolute. His decisions unquestionable. Captain William Reynolds' voice cut through the cabin like ice, his words directed at the quiet teenager in seat 12B. Young lady, I need you to gather your belongings and exit this aircraft immediately. The words hung in the air, heavy and startling. Passengers froze. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turning toward the confrontation unfolding in the middle of the cabin. What they witnessed wasn't just a disagreement. It was raw, ugly prejudice wrapped in the cloak of authority. Captain Reynolds, a decorated veteran pilot with 30 years of experience, stood tall in his crisp uniform, stars gleaming on his shoulders as he stared down at 17-year-old Zoe Bennett. But what Reynolds didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this quiet black teenager wasn't just any passenger. Zoe Bennett held a secret, a connection so powerful that within minutes she wouldn't just challenge his authority. She would ground his entire world. This is the story of how one girl's quiet dignity toppled an empire of arrogance. The air in the jet bridge at JFK Terminal 4 carried that distinct travel scent, recycled air conditioning mingled with the faint metallic hint of jet fuel. For 17-year-old Zoe Bennett, it was the smell of anonymity, and she savored it. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie, dark jeans, and with a pair of well-worn Bose headphones around her neck, she blended seamlessly into the river of passengers flowing into the belly of the Pinnacle Airways Airbus A321. She was just another face in the crowd, a teenager heading to Atlanta, and that's exactly how she wanted it. Her ticket booked under the simple name Z. Bennett was for seat 12B, a middle seat. She didn't mind. Her adoptive father, Dominic Bennett, had offered to book her in first class, but she'd refused. I need to see it how everyone else does, Dad, she had explained over the phone that morning. No special treatment. That's the entire point. Dominic's voice had softened with pride. You know what you're doing. Just remember to document everything, but don't put yourself in a position where I can't walk away, she finished for him. I know. This isn't my first undercover mission. Zoe smiled at the memory as she joined the boarding line. Few people would guess that the unassuming teenager in faded jeans was the adopted daughter of Dominic Bennett, whose name was whispered with reverence in financial circles. Even fewer would know that just 3 months ago, Dominic had become the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Airways through a swift hostile takeover. The acquisition had been strategic, even ruthless. Dominic had seen a legacy airline rotting from within. Inefficiency was just the beginning. More alarming was the culture of customer contempt that had taken root in the company. His plan was to rebuild Pinnacle from the ground up, and Zoe's trip was the first secret step, a grassroots audit. She was his eyes and ears, tasked with observing everything from the cleanliness of the lavatories to the morale of the flight crew. As Zoe found her row, she gave a small, polite smile to the woman by the window and the man on the aisle sliding past them to her designated spot. She buckled her seatbelt, pulled out a paperback novel, and settled in. The pre-flight symphony began around her, clicking overhead bins, murmuring conversations, and the cheerful, slightly strained chimes of call buttons. At 17, Zoe possessed a quiet confidence that often caught people off guard. She had been 9 when Dominic adopted her after her parents, his closest friends, died in a car accident. The first years had been difficult. Grief had made her withdrawn, but Dominic's patience and unwavering support had transformed her. By 13, she was sitting in on business meetings. By 15, she was helping analyze customer feedback for his companies. Now, at 17, she was his secret weapon in understanding the true customer experience. Document, don't intervene, she reminded herself, opening her novel. Today, she was just Zoe Bennett, ordinary passenger. Not the daughter of the airline's new owner. Not the girl who could make or break careers with her report. Just Zoe. For now. Up in the cockpit, the atmosphere was markedly different from the bustling cabin. Captain William Reynolds performed his pre-flight checks with practiced, almost bored efficiency that came from 25 years of commercial flying. His movements were mechanical, precise, the culmination of thousands of identical sequences. Reynolds was a pilot of the old guard. He had silver temples, a jaw that seemed permanently set in mild disapproval, and a deep-seated belief that he was the last bastion of true authority in an increasingly soft world. At 58, he had watched his profession change in ways that left him quietly seething. The new customer is always right initiatives and diversity training seminars felt like personal insults to his expertise and judgment. "Hydraulics check complete," he muttered, initialing the form on his clipboard with a sharp, angry flick of the wrist. APU running normally. His first officer, Miguel Ramirez, was 34, nearly half Reynolds' age, and 10 times more anxious. Miguel respected Reynolds' technical skill immensely. The man could fly through a hurricane with his eyes closed, but was often unnerved by his captain's simmering resentment toward the changing industry. "Last of the stragglers coming on board now," Miguel said, glancing at the small monitor that showed the jet bridge camera. "Should be able to push back on time." Reynolds grunted, not looking up from his checklist. "Let's see if they can manage that. This generation thinks on time is a suggestion." He tapped his watch impatiently. "Back in my day, we respected schedules. We respected authority." Miguel nodded noncommittally, focusing on his own checklist. He'd learned to navigate Reynolds's moods with careful neutrality. 6 months as his first officer had taught him that agreeing too enthusiastically made him seem like a sycophant, while disagreeing even mildly triggered Reynolds's defensiveness. "Ground crew confirms baggage loading is complete," Miguel said, changing the subject. Reynolds nodded, then paused, his attention caught by the cabin monitor. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he studied the grainy feed showing passengers settling into their seats. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to a young woman in a gray hoodie taking her seat in row 12. Miguel glanced at the screen. "Just looks like a teenager." "She keeps looking around," Reynolds said, his voice hardening. "Notice that? Checking all the exits, watching the crew." Miguel looked again. The girl had simply glanced up when a flight attendant passed, then returned to her book. Completely normal behavior. But he knew better than to contradict Reynolds directly. "Probably just first flight nerves," he suggested mildly. Reynolds' mouth tightened. Or something else. He stared at the monitor a moment longer, then returned to his checklist with renewed intensity. But Miguel noticed his eyes flicking back to the screen every few seconds, his focus broken. "Weather looking clear all the way to Atlanta," Miguel said, hoping to redirect Reynolds' attention. "Flight time estimated at 2 hours, 18 minutes. Reynolds nodded absently, but his mind had already latched onto something else. Something that would soon transform Flight 721 from a routine journey into a defining moment for everyone on board. Sophia Davis moved through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency, her smile a masterclass in professional warmth. As the lead flight attendant, she'd been with Pinnacle Airways for nearly 12 years and had developed a sixth sense for flight dynamics, not just the mechanical kind, but the human kind. Today's energy felt off. She couldn't quite place it, but something in the pre-departure rhythm wasn't right. Maybe it was Captain Reynolds. She'd flown with him enough times to recognize his moods, and today he seemed particularly tense. She'd learned to manage difficult pilots with a careful blend of deference and strategic avoidance. "Coffee." "Before we push back, Captain," she asked, poking her head into the cockpit during her pre-flight preparations. "Black 2 sugars," Reynolds replied without looking up. "And make sure the cabin is secured properly this time. Last flight I noticed several bags that weren't completely under the seats." "Of course," Captain Sophia said, evenly ignoring the implied criticism. "We're on it." As she prepared his coffee, her colleague Jordan Taylor approached. At 27, Jordan was newer to Pinnacle, still bright-eyed despite the company's well-known morale issues. Her idealism sometimes irritated the more seasoned crew members, but Sophia appreciated her genuine care for passengers. "Everything okay?" Jordan asked quietly. "Reynolds seems extra prickly today." Sophia handed her the coffee cup. "Just the usual. Here, you take this to him. I need to finish the pre-departure checks." Jordan hesitated. "He doesn't like me. Says I'm too casual with passengers." "You're fine," Sophia assured her. "Just don't engage beyond the essentials." As Jordan reluctantly took the coffee to the cockpit, Sophia continued her walk through the cabin, checking seat belts and overhead bins. When she reached row 12, she noticed a young woman deeply absorbed in her book. There was a quiet intensity about the girl, a composed stillness that stood out amid the travel chaos. Sophia offered a warm smile as she passed. The girl looked up, her eyes bright and intelligent, and returned a small, genuine smile of her own before returning to her reading. Something about her struck Sophia, not just her composure, but the way she seemed to be observing everything while appearing to notice nothing. It reminded Sophia of herself when she'd first started flying, that careful balance between awareness and invisibility. Just as Sophia was about to signal to the gate agent that the cabin was secure, the intercom phone buzzed sharply. She picked it up, expecting the standard pre-departure communication. "Sophia," a word came. Captain Reynolds' voice, clipped and formal. "Go ahead, Captain," she answered, maintaining her professional tone. "Not over the phone. Up here now." The line clicked dead. Sophia sighed, her smile momentarily dropping. She exchanged a look with Jordan, who gave a subtle roll of her eyes. Everyone knew what a summons from Reynolds meant. Another criticism. Another power play. "Watch my zone," Sophia asked, and Jordan nodded. As she walked the length of the aisle toward the cockpit, Sophia couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. 10 years of flying had given her good instincts, and right now those instincts were telling her that something unusual was brewing. She just hoped whatever Reynolds wanted wouldn't delay their departure. She had no way of knowing that this conversation would change not just their schedule, but the entire trajectory of Pinnacle Airways itself. The heavy reinforced cockpit door was slightly ajar when Sophia arrived. She knocked lightly before saying, "Captain, you wanted to see me?" Reynolds didn't turn around. He was staring intently at the same cabin monitor Miguel had been watching earlier, which now showed a live feed of the passengers. His finger was pressed against the screen, tapping the image of a young woman in a gray hoodie. "Seat 12B, he said, his voice low and hard. "Who is she?" Sophia was taken aback by the question. "She's a passenger, Captain. Her name is Bennett, I believe. Boarding pass checked out. Everything's in order." Reynolds finally turned his blue eyes cold as ice chips. "She's been fidgeting, looking around. I've been watching her on the monitor. She looks nervous, suspicious." Miguel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He'd been watching the same monitor and had seen nothing unusual. The girl had looked around when she first sat down the way every passenger does, then opened her book. She wasn't fidgeting. She was turning pages. Sophia knew this was a fabrication, but she chose her words carefully. "Captain, with all due respect, she's just reading. She seems perfectly calm to me." Reynolds' gaze hardened. "Your job is to serve drinks, Sophia. My job is to assess threats, and I am telling you I am not comfortable with that passenger on my aircraft." The implication hung thick and poisonous in the small cockpit. He wasn't just talking about her behavior. Zoe Bennett was one of only a handful of black passengers in the main cabin. Reynolds' suspicion was a thinly veiled excuse, a dog whistle that Sophia had heard from him before in hushed tones and bitter asides, but never so openly, never directed with such clear intent. "Captain, there is no reason, absolutely no reason to single her out," Sophia said, her voice dropping but gaining a firm, steely edge. "I will not be part of this." "You don't have to be." Reynolds snapped, his face reddening. He unbuckled his harness with a decisive click. "Because we're not going anywhere until she's off this plane." He stood up his large frame, filling the cramped cockpit, and pushed past Sophia into the cabin. Captain Miguel started half rising from his seat, but Reynolds was already gone. Sophia stood frozen for a moment, exchanging a horrified glance with Miguel. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "Go," Miguel urged. "I'll call operations." Sophia hurried after Reynolds, her heart pounding. She had witnessed subtle discrimination before, seat reassignments that didn't make sense, extra scrutiny for certain passengers, but never something this blatant, this public. The battle line had been drawn, and every passenger on Pinnacle Airways Flight 721 to Atlanta was now sitting directly on top of it. Zoe Bennett looked up from her book, a flicker of confusion in her eyes, as the imposing figure of the captain stopped directly in front of her row. The quiet anonymity she had cherished was about to be violently shattered. The cabin, which had been buzzing with the low hum of pre-departure anticipation, fell into a confused silence. A pilot emerging from the cockpit before takeoff wasn't unusual, but one who did so with a face like a thundercloud marching down the aisle with grim purpose was a signal that something was wrong. Captain Reynolds stopped at row 12, his polished black shoes almost touching the aisle passengers' feet. He ignored the two travelers on either side of Zoe, his focus locked solely on her. His shadow fell across the pages of her novel. "Miss," he said, the word laced with a condescending bite, usually reserved for scolding a child. "I need to speak with you." Zoe closed her book, slowly marking her page with deliberate care. "Yes, Captain." Her voice was steady, her expression neutral. "There's been a security concern," Reynolds announced loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "I need you to gather your belongings and come with me." Zoe didn't move. What security concern? Sir Reynolds' jaw tightened. "That's not for discussion in the cabin. Please come with me now." Passengers around them began to shift uncomfortably. The man in the aisle seat next to Zoe, a businessman in his 50s, looked between them with growing concern. "Is there a problem with her ticket?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of protective challenge. Reynolds ignored him, his gaze fixed on Zoe. "Last chance, miss. Comply or I'll have security remove you." Sophia arrived behind him, her face professionally composed but her eyes flashing with barely contained anger. "Captain, perhaps we should discuss this privately first." "This is not your concern," Ms. Davis Reynolds said without looking at her. "Security protocol is my responsibility." Zoe sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. To anyone watching, she appeared calm, but inside her mind was racing. Document "Don't intervene" had been her father's instruction, but this wasn't just a rude flight attendant or an uncomfortable seat. This was open discrimination targeting her directly. "Captain Reynolds," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I have a valid ticket. I've done nothing wrong. Unless you can tell me specifically what security concern I've raised, I'm not leaving my seat." The passengers nearby had gone completely silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Someone a few rows back had taken out their phone and was quietly recording. Reynolds leaned closer, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper that still carried to those nearby. "Listen, young lady. I don't know what your game is, but I've been flying planes since before you were born. I can spot trouble, and you are trouble." The naked prejudice in his tone made Zoe's stomach clench, but her expression remained unchanged. She'd been prepared for poor service, for subtle biases her father had warned her they existed at Pinnacle, but not for this open hostility from the captain himself. "My game," she replied evenly, "is traveling to Atlanta to visit my grandmother. That's all." Captain Sophia interjected more firmly. "FAA regulations require specific cause for passenger removal. What exactly is the security concern?" Reynolds turned to her fury, flashing across his face at the public challenge. "Her behavior has been erratic. She's been surveilling the aircraft, watching the crew exhibiting signs of nervousness." A woman across the aisle spoke up. "That's not true. She's been reading her book since she sat down." "Ma'am, please stay out of this," Reynolds snapped. The businessman next to Zoe shifted in his seat. "I'd like to know what's going on, too. This doesn't seem right." Reynolds straightened, adjusting his uniform jacket with a sharp tug. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of his authority. "As captain of this aircraft, I have final say over all security matters. This passenger is being deplaned. That's final." Zoe took a deep breath, carefully weighing her options. She could identify herself as Dominic Bennett's daughter, which would end this immediately. But that would compromise the entire purpose of her undercover audit. Or she could allow herself to be removed, documenting everything for her father's later action. But a third option crystallized in her mind as she looked at the concerned faces around her. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever faced this kind of treatment without having a powerful father to fight their battles. "No," she said simply. "I will not be leaving this flight." The single word "no" hung in the air like a thunderclap. Captain Reynolds blinked, momentarily thrown by Zoe's calm defiance. Passengers exchanged glances, tension crackling through the cabin. In row 3, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses leaned forward, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Reynolds recovered quickly, his face hardening. "This isn't a negotiation. Security will remove you if necessary." Sophia stepped closer, positioning herself slightly between Reynolds and Zoe. "Captain, I must respectfully disagree with your assessment. I've been observing this passenger and there's absolutely no security concern here." The public challenge from his lead flight attendant clearly infuriated Reynolds. But before he could respond, the older man from row 3 stood up. He was tall, distinguished with a gentle but authoritative presence. "Excuse me," he said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the cabin. "I'm Dr. Thomas Wilson, professor of history at Howard University. I couldn't help but overhear, and I'm troubled by what's happening." Reynolds turned sharply. "Sir, please return to your seat. This doesn't concern you." "I'm afraid it does," Dr. Wilson replied calmly. "It concerns all of us when authority is misused." He turned slightly, addressing the other passengers as much as Reynolds. "I've witnessed moments like this before in our history. They never age well." Around the cabin, more passengers were taking out phones, quietly recording. A woman in row 15 stood up. She was in her early 40s with a confident bearing and shrewd eyes. "Gabriela Hernandez," she introduced herself. "I'm an attorney, and I'd like to point out that removing a passenger without clear cause could constitute discrimination, especially given the circumstances." Reynolds's face flushed with anger. "This is my aircraft. You will all return to your seats now, or we'll deplane everyone and sort this out at the gate." Instead of cowering, more passengers began to speak up. "She hasn't done anything wrong," called a young man from the back. "I've been watching. She's just been reading," added a woman nearby. Zoe remained seated, outwardly calm. Under her tray table, hidden from view, she sent a text to her father. "It's happening. Exactly as you predicted. Captain Reynolds' discrimination targeting me directly." Reynolds' eyes darted around the cabin, clearly not expecting this level of passenger resistance. His authority, something he'd wielded unquestioned for decades, was being challenged by ordinary people with nothing more than their sense of justice. "This is a security matter," he insisted, his voice rising. "I am the captain. This is my aircraft. I make the final decision about who flies." From the cockpit doorway, Miguel appeared, having heard the commotion. His face paled as he took in the scene. This was rapidly spiraling beyond a minor incident into something that could end careers, including his own, if he didn't act. "Captain, he called operations is on the line. They need to speak with you." Reynolds ignored him, focusing instead on Zoe with renewed intensity. "Last chance. Gather your belongings and leave quietly." Dr. Wilson moved into the aisle, not confrontational but firmly present. "Young lady," he said to Zoe, "you don't have to go anywhere. Your ticket is valid and you've broken no rules." "Sir, "I'm warning you," Reynolds began, but Wilson cut him off with a raised hand. "I've seen this story play out before, Captain. In Montgomery. In Greensboro. The ending never favors those who try to exclude." His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of history. Other passengers were now openly discussing the situation, the mood shifting from confused observation to active participation. The cabin had divided into factions, some supporting the captain's authority, others vocally defending Zoe. Phone cameras recorded every moment. Sophia exchanged a quick glance with Jordan, who had appeared near the front of the cabin. A silent communication passed between them. This had gone too far to back down now. Captain Sophia said firmly, "I am officially registering my disagreement with this action. There is no legitimate security concern with this passenger." Reynolds turned on her, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You're risking your job, Davis." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm doing my job, Captain, ensuring fair treatment of all passengers." The confrontation had transformed from a pilot's unilateral decision into a public referendum on authority and justice. And with every passing moment, more passengers were choosing sides. Captain Reynolds' face had turned a dangerous shade of red. He stood rigid in the aisle, his authority visibly eroding with each passing second. The cabin had become a pressure cooker with Reynolds at the center. Enough, he barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This flight is not leaving until that passenger is removed. That is my final decision." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Reynolds turned to Sophia. "Call the gate. Have them send security to remove this passenger." Sophia stood her ground. "I will not do that, Captain. There is absolutely no reason to remove this passenger." Jordan stepped forward to stand beside Sophia, her voice shaking slightly but determined. "I agree with Ms. Davis. This isn't right." Reynolds' eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're both risking your careers." "Davis, Taylor, this is insubordination." "It's integrity," Sophia corrected quietly. From the cockpit, Miguel watched the standoff with mounting anxiety. Protocols were clear. The captain had final authority over security matters, but this wasn't about security. This was about something ugly and personal. He had a choice: remain silent and be complicit, or speak up and potentially end his career. He stepped forward into the cabin. "Captain, I need to speak with you privately." Reynolds rounded on him. "Not now, Ramirez." Yes, now Miguel insisted, his voice firmer than it had ever been with Reynolds. "As first officer, I have safety concerns about your current judgment." A collective intake of breath swept through the cabin. A first officer challenging a captain publicly was almost unheard of. Reynolds stared at Miguel as if he'd been slapped. "You will return to the cockpit immediately," Reynolds ordered. "Not until we resolve this," Miguel replied, surprising even himself with his resolve. At the gate, airline staff had become aware of the situation. A supervisor was speaking urgently into a phone while two gate agents hovered anxiously by the aircraft door, uncertain whether to intervene. In seat 12B, Zoe remained the calm center of the storm. She hadn't raised her voice or made a scene. She had simply refused to accept injustice, and that refusal had catalyzed something powerful around her. Reynolds, sensing his control slipping away completely, made his most dangerous play. "Fine," he announced loudly. "If security won't remove her, I'll do it myself." He reached for Zoe's arm. The reaction was immediate. The businessman in the aisle seat shot to his feet, blocking Reynolds. "Don't touch her, doctor." Wilson moved swiftly down the aisle. "Captain, that would be assault." Gabriela Hernandez had her phone up recording. "Everyone is witnessing this," she called out. Reynolds froze, his hand suspended in midair as he realized he was surrounded not by passive travelers but by engaged citizens who had drawn a line. His face twisted with fury as he addressed the entire cabin. "I am the captain of this aircraft. My word is final. Either she leaves or we don't fly." The ultimatum hung in the air for a moment before a clear voice cut through the tension. "Then we don't fly," said Dr. Wilson firmly. "I'll wait for the next flight called another passenger." "Me too," echoed several others. A remarkable thing was happening. Passengers were choosing justice over convenience, solidarity over schedules. The quiet girl in 12B had become a symbol of something larger than herself, and ordinary people were taking extraordinary stands. Reynolds looked around wildly, his authority evaporating before his eyes. In a last desperate attempt to regain control, he uttered the words that would ultimately seal his fate. "I am God on this plane. What I say goes, and I say she goes now." The statement sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. Several passengers gasped. Jordan covered her mouth. Miguel closed his eyes briefly, knowing that statement would haunt Reynolds forever. And through it all, Zoe sat still, her hands folded in her lap, watching history unfold around her with clear, observant eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the cabin. "I think she said carefully that my father would be very interested to hear those words, Captain Reynolds." The cabin had transformed into something none of them had experienced before, not just a confrontation, but a genuine community forming in real time around a shared sense of justice. People who had boarded as strangers were now unified by a collective purpose. Live streams were multiplying across the cabin. A young woman near the back narrated events for her viewers. "The captain is trying to remove a teenage girl for absolutely no reason. She's just sitting there reading. Everyone can see what's really happening." The videos were already spreading beyond the aircraft. Hashtag Pinnacle Discrimination began trending within minutes as clips circulated on social media platforms. Dr. Wilson had taken on an unofficial role as mediator, his academic expertise giving him a unique perspective. "What we're witnessing," he explained to those seated near him, "is a textbook example of authority confronting changing social norms. Throughout history, moments like these have been catalysts for institutional change." Gabriela Hernandez moved through the cabin quietly, informing passengers of their rights. "They can't remove you for supporting her," she assured a nervous elderly couple. "Document everything. This matters." Near the front, a businesswoman in her 60s named Nancy Parker watched the unfolding scene with visible discomfort. Unlike many passengers, she sided with Reynolds. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly. "If the captain has security concerns, we should trust his judgment. He's trying to keep us safe." Her comment created a small island of agreement among some passengers, revealing the cabin's division. A man nearby nodded. "The captain has final authority for a reason. We don't have to like it, but we should respect it." The conflict had become symbolic of larger societal divisions, trust in traditional authority versus demands for accountability, personal convenience versus collective justice. Reynolds seized on this support. "These passengers understand. Safety isn't a democracy. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made." Zoe, who had remained largely silent throughout, finally turned to address Nancy Parker directly. "Ma'am, I respect your concern for safety, but what exactly have I done that makes me a threat I've been reading quietly since I boarded?" The simple, direct question left Parker momentarily flustered. "Well, I assume the captain has his reasons." "But what are those reasons?" Zoe pressed gently. "Should someone be removed from a flight without a clear explanation?" Before Parker could answer, Reynolds interjected. "I don't have to explain myself to passengers." "Actually, you do," Sophia countered, gaining confidence. "Passenger removal requires documentation and justification." At the gate, Pinnacle ground staff were becoming increasingly concerned. The delayed departure was creating a ripple effect throughout the system, and the social media explosion was reaching alarming proportions. The station manager was on the phone with corporate headquarters, desperately seeking guidance. Inside the plane, the atmosphere continued to intensify. More passengers had left their seats, forming loose clusters of conversation throughout the cabin. What had begun as one man's prejudice had evolved into a spontaneous forum on rights, respect, and responsibility. Miguel approached Reynolds, speaking quietly but firmly. "Captain, this has gone too far. We need to de-escalate. Reynolds rounded on him. Whose side are you on? Ramirez Miguel stood his ground. I'm on the side of doing our job professionally. This isn't professional. In seat 12B, Zoe received a text message. She glanced down at her phone, and for the first time since the confrontation began, a small smile touched her lips. What's so funny? Reynolds demanded, noticing her expression. Nothing funny, Captain Zoe replied calmly. Just confirmation that help is on the way. Reynolds' eyes narrowed suspiciously. What does that mean? Who are you texting? Before she could answer, Gabriela Hernandez called out from the back. Captain Reynolds, you should know that my law firm represents several civil rights organizations. They're already being briefed on this situation. The pressure was mounting from all sides. Reynolds' face showed the first flickers of doubt as he realized the situation had escalated far beyond his control. But rather than backing down, he doubled down. Security! He shouted toward the aircraft door. I need security in here now. The aircraft door reopened, and a stocky man in a navy blue uniform stepped into the cabin. Anthony Whitfield, head of security at JFK Terminal 4, surveyed the scene with the measured calm of someone who had handled countless difficult situations. What's the situation, Captain? He asked Reynolds, his voice neutral but authoritative. Reynolds pointed at Zoe. This passenger needs to be removed. Security concern. Anthony glanced at Zoe, then back at Reynolds. What's the specific concern, Captain? Suspicious behavior. Watching crew movements, surveilling exits. I don't feel comfortable with her on my aircraft. Anthony nodded thoughtfully, then asked, Has she made any threatening statements or actions? She's refusing to comply with my orders, Reynolds replied, frustration evident in his voice. That's enough. Sophia stepped forward. Mr. Whitfield, I'm the lead flight attendant. I've been observing this passenger since boarding, and there has been absolutely no suspicious behavior. She's been reading quietly. This request for removal has no legitimate basis. Anthony's expression remained professional, but his eyes sharpened. He was caught in a difficult position. Airline protocol gave captains significant authority, but what he was seeing didn't align with Reynolds's claims. Young lady, he addressed Zoe directly. Have you been asked why you're being removed? No, sir, Zoe replied. Captain Reynolds simply said I was a security concern without explanation. Dr. Wilson joined the conversation. Sir, dozens of us have been watching. This young woman has done nothing wrong. Anthony took a moment to assess the cabin, the standing passengers, the recording phones, the palpable tension. He'd been in security long enough to recognize when a situation had crossed a critical threshold, and this one clearly had. Captain, he said carefully, I'm not comfortable removing a passenger without clear cause, especially given the circumstances. Reynolds' face darkened. Are you refusing to do your job? I'm doing my job properly, Anthony corrected. Passenger removal requires documented cause. As they argued, multiple passengers had formed a protective circle around Zoe. It wasn't planned or coordinated. It was instinctive, a human wall of conscience. We're not letting you take her, said the businessman from the aisle seat firmly. You'll have to remove all of us, added a woman from across the aisle. The standoff had reached its breaking point. Reynolds, sensing his authority crumbling completely, made one final desperate play. He addressed the entire cabin, his voice rising to a near shout. Anyone interfering with crew instructions is violating federal law. All of you could be arrested. The threat hung in the air for a moment before Gabriela Hernandez responded coolly. Unlawful instructions aren't protected, Captain. We all know what's happening here. As the confrontation reached its apex, Zoe remained the calm center of the storm. Outwardly composed, she was experiencing a complex mix of emotions, anger at the injustice, pride in the passengers standing up for her, and a deep sadness that such bigotry still existed. She thought back to conversations with her father, lessons he'd taught her about navigating a world that wouldn't always see her worth. There will be moments, Dominic had told her once, when people will try to make you feel small, try to erase you from spaces they believe you don't deserve to occupy. In those moments, remember who you are. Not just my daughter, but a human being worthy of dignity. Your power isn't in shouting louder, but in standing firmer. Back in the present, Reynolds was issuing his final ultimatum to Anthony Whitfield. Remove her now, or I'll call your supervisor and have you removed too. Anthony straightened, making his decision. Captain Reynolds, I cannot in good conscience remove this passenger without valid cause. If you insist on this course of action, I'll need to escalate to my supervisor and airline management. The words were barely out of his mouth when a commotion at the aircraft door drew everyone's attention. A man in a tailored suit had appeared, flanked by two Pinnacle Airlines representatives in corporate attire. The energy in the cabin shifted instantly. Even before he spoke, there was something in the man's bearing, a quiet, absolute confidence that commanded attention. Reynolds turned irritation clear on his face at yet another interruption. "Who are you?" he demanded. "This is a secure area." The man stepped forward, his gaze moving from Reynolds to Zoe and back again. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried to every corner of the cabin. "My name is Dominic Bennett. I believe you've met my daughter." Time seemed to freeze in the cabin. Passengers exchanged confused glances, not yet grasping the significance of the newcomer. Reynolds stared at Dominic Bennett, his expression shifting from irritation to uncertainty. "Your daughter, Reynolds," repeated, his eyes darting between Dominic and Zoe. Dominic moved with unhurried purpose down the aisle. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that spoke of quiet wealth rather than flashy status. At 52, he carried himself with the assured dignity of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. His presence alone changed the energy of the aircraft, not through intimidation, but through absolute certainty. "Yes, Captain Reynolds." "Zoe Bennett, my daughter, Dominic," confirmed, stopping a few feet from Reynolds. "Though that's hardly the most relevant fact at the moment." Reynolds's mind was working quickly, trying to place the name. Bennett. Something about that name had been in the company newsletters recently, but he couldn't quite. Mr. Bennett, one of the Pinnacle representatives, said quickly, stepping forward, "We're deeply sorry for any misunderstanding." Recognition finally dawned in Reynolds' eyes. A flash of realization followed immediately by the first traces of fear. "You're the new majority shareholder?" he said, his voice losing its commanding edge. Dominic didn't acknowledge the statement. Instead, he looked at Zoe, his expression softening momentarily. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Dad," she answered simply. He nodded once, then turned back to Reynolds, his face a controlled mask of fury held firmly in check. This wasn't the wild anger of someone losing control. This was the cold, focused rage of someone who had seen injustice too many times before. "Captain Reynolds." Dominic began, his voice deceptively calm. "I received a concerning text from my daughter about 20 minutes ago. She described a situation that, quite frankly, I found difficult to believe." He glanced around the cabin, taking in the standing passengers, the recording phones, the palpable tension. "Now I see she wasn't exaggerating." Reynolds drew himself up, attempting to regain his authority. "Mr. Bennett, with all due respect, this is an operational matter." As captain. Dominic cut him off smoothly. "You have a responsibility to ensure the safety of this aircraft and its passengers. Tell me exactly how was my 17-year-old daughter threatening that safety?" Reynolds floundered for a moment. She exhibited suspicious behavior. What behavior? Dominic pressed. Looking around, surveilling exits, Dr. Wilson stepped forward. "Sir, I've been watching since before the captain approached. Your daughter was simply reading her book." She refused to comply. Reynolds tried again. With an unlawful order, Gabriela Hernandez interjected. "I'm an attorney, Mr. Bennett. What happened here was textbook discrimination. Dominic listened to the passengers with a thoughtful nod before turning back to Reynolds. "It seems we have quite a few witnesses contradicting your assessment, Captain." The corporate representatives looked increasingly uncomfortable. One of them, a woman in her late 40s with a VP pin on her lapel, stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Eliza Montgomery, Executive Vice President of Operations. We can discuss this privately." "No," Dominic said firmly. "This didn't happen privately, did it? Captain Reynolds didn't privately ask my daughter to leave this aircraft. He didn't privately threaten her. He did it right here in front of everyone." He gestured to the cabin. "So we'll address it right here in front of everyone." The atmosphere was electric. Passengers who had been recording now lowered their phones slightly, not wanting to miss a word. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was a reckoning. Reynolds made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Bennett, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Security protocols sometimes require difficult decisions." "Stop." Dominic said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that made Reynolds instantly silent. "Let's be absolutely clear about what happened here. You saw a young black woman sitting quietly in your aircraft and you decided she didn't belong. You invented a security concern to justify removing her, and when she refused to accept that injustice, you threatened her." He paused, looking Reynolds directly in the eyes. "What you didn't know was that she's my daughter. But here's what troubles me most, Captain Reynolds. What if she hadn't been? What if she'd been any other young black woman without connections? Would anyone have stood up for her then?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and necessary. Several passengers looked down, perhaps considering times they'd witnessed similar situations, and remained silent. Dominic continued, his voice steady. "The fact that she's my daughter isn't why this is wrong. It's wrong because no one should be treated this way regardless of who they are or who their parents might be." Reynolds had gone pale, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake and its potential consequences. But pride, or perhaps fear, kept him from backing down completely. "Mr. Bennett," he said stiffly, "I apologize if there's been a misunderstanding, but I still have authority over this aircraft." Dominic's expression didn't change as he delivered the words that would change everything. "Not anymore, Captain Reynolds. Not anymore." "What did you just say?" Reynolds asked, his voice dropping dangerously low. "I said," Dominic repeated calmly, "that this is no longer your aircraft, Captain Reynolds." The Executive Vice President, Eliza Montgomery, stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, while I understand your concern, there are protocols I'm familiar with." "The protocols," Ms. Montgomery Dominic interrupted smoothly. "As majority shareholder and acting chairman of the board, I'm invoking emergency powers under Section 5.3 of the company charter, which allows for immediate removal of any staff member whose actions threaten the company's integrity or safety." He turned back to Reynolds. "Captain Reynolds, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately." The legal precision of Dominic's statement made it clear this wasn't an emotional reaction. He knew exactly what he was doing and had the authority to do it. Reynolds' face flushed with anger and disbelief. "You can't do that. You can't just walk onto an aircraft and remove a captain." "Actually, he can," Eliza confirmed reluctantly, the color draining from her face. "Mr. Bennett does have that authority." Reynolds looked around wildly as if searching for allies, but found only the silent stares of passengers and crew. His world was collapsing around him in real time. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "One little inconvenience to your daughter, and you're abusing your power." "This is not about inconvenience," Captain Dominic said, his voice hardening for the first time. "This is about discrimination. This is about abuse of authority. This is about the culture of this airline that allowed you to believe you could behave this way without consequences." Dominic turned to Miguel, who had been standing nearby. First Officer Ramirez, correct? Miguel straightened. Yes, sir. I understand you questioned Captain Reynolds' judgment during this incident. Miguel swallowed hard but answered firmly. Yes, sir. I did. Dominic nodded approvingly. You're now acting captain for this flight. Can you safely operate this aircraft to Atlanta? Miguel's eyes widened slightly, but he recovered quickly. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Good, Dominic said. Ms. Davis will continue as lead flight attendant. He turned to Reynolds. Captain, please collect your personal belongings from the cockpit. Mr. Whitfield will escort you from the aircraft. Reynolds stood frozen, the full reality of what was happening finally sinking in. You're destroying my career over this 30 years of service, and you're ending it because I tried to maintain security. No. Captain Dominic replied evenly. You're destroying your career by choosing discrimination over dignity. The fact that you still don't understand what you did wrong tells me this isn't your first time. It's just the first time you've been held accountable. A ripple of approval moved through the cabin. Dr. Wilson nodded solemnly. Gabriela Hernandez had never stopped recording. Reynolds made one last desperate stand. I'm not leaving. This is my flight. Dominic sighed, then turned to address the entire cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the continued delay. It seems Captain Reynolds requires some additional persuasion. He nodded to Anthony Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, please call for backup. Captain Reynolds will be leaving this aircraft either willingly or with assistance. The security chief nodded and spoke into his radio. Reynolds looked around the cabin, finally comprehending how completely he had lost control of the situation. You're making a mistake, he said to Dominic, his voice hollow. You'll regret this. No, Captain Dominic replied. The only mistake was allowing a culture where someone like you could feel empowered to act the way you did today. The only regret I have is not being here sooner. 2 additional security officers appeared at the aircraft door. Reynolds' shoulders sagged as the fight finally left him. Without another word, he turned and walked stiffly toward the cockpit to collect his belongings. As Reynolds disappeared into the cockpit, a spontaneous round of applause broke out among the passengers. Some stood, others simply nodded in approval. The release of tension was palpable. Dominic raised his hands, calming the cabin. Please, this isn't a victory to celebrate. This is a failure that we're beginning to address. He turned to Miguel. Captain Ramirez, how quickly can you prepare for departure? Miguel straightened at his new title. 20 minutes, sir. I'll need to complete the pre-flight checks again. Good. Please proceed, Dominic said, then turned to Sophia. Ms. Davis, please ensure the cabin is ready for departure as soon as possible. Both nodded and moved to their duties with renewed purpose. The confrontation was over, but its impact was just beginning to ripple outward. In the middle of the cabin, Zoe remained in her seat watching her father with a mixture of pride and something more complex, a recognition of the power he wielded and the responsibility that came with it. When their eyes met briefly across the cabin, an unspoken understanding passed between them. This moment would change everything, not just for them, but for Pinnacle Airways and everyone who worked there. As Reynolds emerged from the cockpit, escorted by Anthony Whitfield and his officers, the cabin fell silent again. There was no gloating, no jeering, just the heavy weight of witness as a man who had abused his authority faced the consequences of his actions. Just before Reynolds reached the door, Dominic called out, "Captain." Reynolds turned his face a mask of defeated anger. "The world is changing," Dominic said quietly. "You can change with it, or you can be left behind. That choice is still yours." Reynolds didn't respond. With a final bitter glance around the cabin, he stepped through the door and was gone. With Reynolds gone, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. The crisis had passed, but a new uncertainty hung in the air. Passengers returned to their seats, discussing the events in hushed tones. The confrontation had forged an unusual bond among them, strangers who had witnessed something extraordinary together. Dominic Bennett moved to the front of the aircraft where Eliza Montgomery was speaking quietly with the other corporate representative. Their conversation looked tense, with Eliza gesturing emphatically while the other executive kept shaking his head. In the cockpit, Miguel Ramirez was methodically working through the pre-flight checklist, his movements precise, but his mind still processing the dramatic turn of events. He had come to work expecting a routine flight to Atlanta. Now he was suddenly acting captain after witnessing the downfall of a 30-year veteran. Sophia Davis moved efficiently through the cabin, checking seatbelts and overhead bins, but her usual professional smile had been replaced by a more genuine expression, relief mixed with vindication. Jordan Taylor followed behind her, both flight attendants working with renewed purpose. After several minutes, Dominic turned to address the cabin. The passengers fell silent immediately, all eyes drawn to the man who had so dramatically altered the course of the day. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily without the need for the intercom, "I want to sincerely apologize for the delay and disruption to your travel plans today. What you witnessed was unacceptable, and I thank you for your patience during this difficult situation." He paused, looking around the cabin, making eye contact with several passengers before continuing. "My name is Dominic Bennett. 3 months ago, I became the majority shareholder of Pinnacle Airways. What you may not know is why I chose to invest in this airline." His expression grew more serious. Pinnacle was once known for excellence, for treating passengers with dignity and respect. But in recent years, something changed. A culture developed that allowed incidents like what you witnessed today, not just one rogue employee, but a pattern of behavior that had become normalized. From her seat in 12B, Zoe watched her father with quiet pride. This wasn't just about defending his daughter. This was about the vision he had shared with her from the beginning, transforming Pinnacle back into an airline where everyone was treated with dignity. Today, Dominic continued. "My daughter Zoe was conducting what we call a passenger experience audit, traveling anonymously to experience Pinnacle as ordinary customers do. What happened to her happens to countless travelers every day, people judged not by their actions, but by their appearance. The difference is that today there were consequences." Dr. Wilson nodded solemnly. "It's about time," he murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I know many of you have connections to make in Atlanta, and others have important commitments," Dominic acknowledged. "Captain Ramirez is preparing the aircraft for departure, and we should be underway shortly." He paused, and the cabin sensed he was approaching his most important point. "However, before we continue, I need to share a decision I've made, one that will affect not just this flight, but every Pinnacle Airways flight worldwide." The cabin grew even quieter, passengers leaning forward slightly. Effective immediately, Dominic announced, his voice firm and resolute. "All Pinnacle Airways flights are grounded." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Eliza Montgomery closed her eyes briefly, her worst fears confirmed. "This isn't just about one incident or one captain," Dominic explained, holding up his hands to quiet the growing murmurs. "This is about addressing a broken culture from the ground up. Every aircraft, every route, every flight grounded until we can implement immediate reforms to ensure that what happened here today never happens again." The magnitude of the decision was staggering. Pinnacle operated hundreds of flights daily across multiple continents. Grounding the entire airline was unprecedented. A financial and logistical earthquake. Mr. Bennett called out a businessman from the front row. "What does this mean for passengers currently in transit, or those waiting at airports around the world?" "A fair question," Dominic acknowledged. "All passengers will be fully accommodated on partner airlines, with Pinnacle covering any additional costs. Those already in transit will complete their journeys. But no new Pinnacle flights will depart after those currently in the airland." He gestured to Eliza and the other executive. Miss Montgomery and her team are already implementing our emergency passenger protection protocols. No one will be stranded." The cabin buzzed with conversation, passengers torn between admiration for the bold stand and concern about the practical implications. Dominic let them process for a moment before continuing. "I understand this decision affects thousands of people, passengers and employees alike. But sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to stop it, completely identify what's wrong, and rebuild it properly." From row 15, Gabriela Hernandez spoke up. "Mr. Bennett, how long will this grounding last?" 72 hours? "Minimum," Dominic replied without hesitation. "During that time, we will implement new training protocols, establish clear anti-discrimination policies with actual consequences, and create independent oversight mechanisms." Nancy Parker, the businesswoman who had initially supported Reynolds, raised her hand. "Isn't this an extreme overreaction to one incident? The economic impact will be enormous." Dominic nodded thoughtfully. "It would be extreme if this were truly one isolated incident, Ms. Parker. Nancy Parker. Ms. Parker, what you saw today wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a pervasive problem that has gone unaddressed for too long. Yes, the economic impact will be significant to our shareholders, to our bottom line, to my own investments. But I have to ask, what's the cost of allowing discrimination to continue unchecked? What's the price of looking the other way when people are denied basic dignity?" Before Nancy could respond, Zoe stood up from her seat. All eyes turned to her. Throughout the confrontation, she had remained largely silent, the unwilling catalyst for these events. Now she spoke with a quiet confidence that belied her 17 years. "The problem isn't just with Pinnacle," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's everywhere. The difference is what we choose to do about it." She looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of various passengers. "Everyone here made a choice today. Those who spoke up, those who recorded, those who formed a circle around me. You chose to not look away. That's what changes things." The cabin fell silent, absorbing her words. Dr. Wilson nodded approvingly. Even Nancy Parker seemed thoughtful. Dominic smiled at his daughter with unmistakable pride before addressing the cabin again. "Flight 721 will continue to Atlanta as planned. Upon arrival, all passengers will receive full refunds, additional compensation, and priority rebooking on partner airlines for any connecting flights." He looked around the cabin one final time. "What happened today wasn't planned, but how we respond to it, that's a choice. Pinnacle Airways will emerge from this as a different airline, one that truly values every passenger regardless of who they are or what they look like." As if to punctuate his statement, the engines began to spool up. Miguel's voice came over the intercom, "Cabin crew, prepare for departure." Dominic moved back down the aisle toward seat 12B, stopping to speak briefly with various passengers along the way. When he reached Zoe, he squeezed her shoulder gently before taking the seat across the aisle that had been hurriedly vacated for him. Flight 721 would soon be airborne, carrying not just its passengers to Atlanta, but the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through an entire industry. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, news of Dominic Bennett's unprecedented decision was already spreading across social media news outlets and airline boardrooms worldwide. The grounding of Pinnacle Airways had begun. The scene at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was unlike anything in recent memory. News crews crowded the terminals. Passengers clustered around television screens, and social media feeds overflowed with first-hand accounts from Flight 721. Breaking: Billionaire grounds. Entire airline after discrimination. Incident: Pinnacle Airways CEO calls. Emergency board meeting. Amid fleet-wide grounding. Captain removed mid-flight after attempting to eject black teenager. As Flight 721 taxied to the gate, passengers could see the media frenzy waiting for them through the small oval windows. Some prepared to share their stories. Others simply wanted to disappear into anonymity. Dominic leaned across the aisle toward Zoe. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her expression determined. "We knew something might happen during the audit. Just not quite this dramatic. You have a choice," he reminded her. "You can exit through the private terminal. No cameras, no questions." Zoe considered this for a moment before shaking her head. "No. I need to be seen." "That's the whole point, isn't it? Visibility matters." Dominic smiled with quiet pride. "Whatever you decide, I'll support you." As the aircraft door opened, Sophia Davis approached them. "Mr. Bennett, Ms. Bennett, we've arranged for you to deplane first if you wish." "Thank you, Ms. Davis," Dominic replied. "But I think we'll exit with the other passengers. No special treatment." Sophia nodded, understanding the symbolism of the choice. "It's been an honor to meet you both, despite the circumstances." As passengers began gathering their belongings, many stopped to speak with Zoe and Dominic, offering support, sharing contact information, expressing gratitude for the stand they had taken. Dr. Wilson clasped Dominic's hand firmly. "What you did today wasn't just about one flight," the professor said. "It was about challenging a pattern that's persisted for far too long." Gabriela Hernandez handed Dominic her business card. "My firm would be honored to assist with implementing the new policies. Pro bono, of course." Meanwhile, across the country and around the world, the impact of Dominic's decision was already sending shockwaves through the aviation industry. At Chicago, O'Hare-stranded Pinnacle passengers crowded customer service desks, their reactions ranging from fury to understanding as agents explained the unprecedented situation. "So we're not flying because some pilot was racist," demanded one irritated businessman. "Sir, we're rebooking you on American Airlines," the agent replied calmly. "Your new departure time is in 90 minutes, and Pinnacle is covering all additional costs, plus providing a full refund and compensation." In Pinnacle's corporate headquarters, the emergency boardroom was chaos. Executives shouted over each other while financial analysts calculated the staggering costs of the grounding. The CEO, Francis Blackwell, a veteran aviation executive known for prioritizing profits over people, pounded the table in frustration. "He can't do this. Bennett has exceeded his authority." Eliza Montgomery, who had returned on the first available flight from New York, stood her ground. "Actually, he can. I've reviewed the company charter with legal. As majority shareholder and acting chairman, he has emergency powers in situations involving company-wide ethical breaches." "This is one incident," Blackwell shouted. "One captain on one flight." "It's not just one incident," Eliza countered, sliding a folder across the table. "These are complaints filed over the last 2 years, discrimination, profiling, selective enforcement of policies. All buried, all ignored." The board members exchanged uneasy glances as they reviewed the documents. "How did Bennett get these?" someone asked. Eliza straightened her shoulders. "I gave them to him. Someone had to." In a television studio in Atlanta, William Reynolds sat uncomfortably under the bright lights, his uniform replaced by a wrinkled suit, his confidence shattered. The interview wasn't going as he'd hoped. "Captain Reynolds, you've claimed this was about security, not race," the interviewer pressed. "But multiple witnesses, including the head of airport security, have stated there was no observable security concern. How do you respond to that?" Reynolds shifted in his seat. "My job is to assess potential threats. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions based on instinct and experience. And in 30 years of flying, has your instinct ever led you to remove a white teenager for reading a book Reynolds face flushed? This isn't fair. You're twisting the situation. We're simply asking questions based on eyewitness accounts and video evidence," the interviewer replied coolly, "including your statement captured on multiple recordings that you are God on this plane." Would you like to explain that remark?" As Reynolds fumbled for a response, the damage to his reputation deepened with every word. Back at the Atlanta airport, Zoe and Dominic finally emerged into the terminal, immediately surrounded by cameras and microphones. Dominic stepped slightly forward, instinctively shielding his daughter while addressing the press. "My daughter and I will make a full statement later today," he said firmly. "For now, I'll simply say this. What happened on Flight 721 reflects a broader problem not just at Pinnacle but throughout the industry. The grounding of our fleet isn't punitive, it's corrective. We're hitting pause to ensure we get this right." A reporter shouted over the others, "Mr. Bennett, industry analysts are calling this financial suicide. Pinnacle's stock has already dropped 17%. Dominic's expression didn't waver. Some things are more important than stock prices. Dignity is one of them. As they moved through the terminal, Dominic's phone buzzed continuously with messages from board members, executives, and industry leaders, some supportive, others furious, all recognizing that the landscape of commercial aviation had shifted dramatically in a matter of hours. Zoe walked beside her father, her head high despite the cameras. What had begun as a simple undercover audit had catalyzed something much larger than either of them had anticipated. But as she caught glimpses of the news coverage on terminal screens, showing images of Reynolds confronting her contrasted with Dominic's decisive intervention, she knew they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no turning back. The transformation of Pinnacle Airways had begun, and the world was watching. 3 days later, the grand ballroom of the Pinnacle Airways Training Center in Dallas was filled to capacity. Employees from all levels of the company, pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, administrative staff sat in rows, an air of nervous anticipation permeating the room. At precisely 10:00 a.m., Dominic Bennett walked onto the stage, accompanied by Sophia Davis, Miguel Ramirez, and several executives including Eliza Montgomery. "Good morning," Dominic began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "3 days ago, I made the difficult decision to ground our entire fleet. Today, I want to explain why that decision was necessary and, more importantly, where we go from here." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. Many appeared apprehensive, some openly skeptical, a few nodding in support. What happened on Flight 721 wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a culture that had lost its way. A culture that allowed discrimination to go unchallenged, that prioritized authority over accountability, that forgot our fundamental purpose to serve all our passengers with dignity and respect. On large screens behind him, data from passenger complaints appeared, statistics that many in the room had never seen before, showing clear patterns of discriminatory treatment. These numbers tell a story. Dominic continued. A story of consistent bias that has been systematically ignored or buried. Today, that changes. He outlined the comprehensive reforms that had been developed during the 72-hour grounding. "First effective immediately, we're launching the Davis Initiative," Dominic announced, gesturing to Sophia, who stepped forward. Named after the flight attendant who had the courage to stand up to a captain when she witnessed discrimination. Sophia took the microphone, her usual professional composure momentarily giving way to emotion. "The Davis Initiative isn't just another training program. It's a complete reimagining of how we approach customer service and internal accountability." She outlined the program's core components: mandatory quarterly anti-discrimination training for all employees, a new independent oversight committee comprised of civil rights experts, passenger advocates, and industry professionals, and perhaps most revolutionary, a comprehensive system for reporting and addressing bias incidents with real consequences. No more burying complaints, Sophia emphasized. No more protecting those who abuse their authority, regardless of their position or tenure. When she finished, Miguel Ramirez took the stage. The young pilot, still adjusting to his sudden prominence in the company, spoke with newfound confidence. "As pilots, we're trained to prioritize safety above all else," he began. "But true safety isn't just about mechanical systems or weather conditions. It's about creating an environment where every passenger feels secure, respected, and valued. He announced a complete overhaul of Pinnacle's pilot training program with new emphasis on ethical decision-making, cultural sensitivity, and appropriate use of authority. Most significantly, he introduced a new peer accountability system that would allow any crew member to challenge potentially discriminatory actions without fear of retaliation. Throughout the morning, more speakers took the stage, executives outlining structural changes, HR representatives introducing new hiring and promotion criteria, even former passengers sharing their experiences. The message was consistent and clear. Pinnacle Airways was undergoing not just a policy shift, but a fundamental transformation of its identity. As the formal presentations concluded, Dominic returned to the stage for what would become the most talked-about moment of the day. Change isn't just about new policies, he said, his tone more personal than before. It's about leadership. It's about who we choose to elevate and empower. He invited Eliza Montgomery to join him. I'm pleased to announce that the board has unanimously approved my recommendation of Eliza Montgomery as the new Chief Executive Officer of Pinnacle Airways. The announcement sent ripples of surprise through the audience. Francis Blackwell, the previous CEO, was conspicuously absent. Ms. Montgomery demonstrated exceptional integrity during the Flight 721 incident, Dominic explained. When others were concerned about stock prices and PR damage, she focused on doing what was right. That's the leadership Pinnacle needs moving forward. Eliza stepped to the microphone, her expression serious but determined. Thank you, Mr. Bennett. To everyone in this room, I won't promise that the road ahead will be easy. Transforming a corporate culture never is. What I will promise is that we'll walk this road together with transparency, accountability, and an unwavering commitment to treating every person, passenger, or employee with dignity. As the formal presentation concluded, the atmosphere in the room had noticeably shifted. The initial apprehension had given way to something more complex, a mixture of hope, determination, and the sober recognition of the challenging work ahead. Outside the training center, the media had gathered in force. The story of Pinnacle's grounding and subsequent reforms had captivated the public imagination, becoming a focal point for broader conversations about corporate responsibility, institutional racism, and the power of decisive leadership. Dominic and Eliza held a press conference fielding questions about the financial impact of the grounding, substantial but manageable, the status of Captain Reynolds' formal termination proceedings underway, and the timeline for implementing the new initiatives immediate and ongoing. When asked about the unprecedented nature of his decision to ground the entire airline, Dominic's response was characteristically direct. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is to stop it completely, examine what's wrong, and rebuild it properly. We could have made superficial changes while keeping planes in the air, issued apologies, conducted reviews, promised to do better. But that approach has failed countless times before. Real change requires real commitment, and real commitment often requires sacrifice. As Pinnacle Airways resumed operations the following day, passengers discovered a transformed experience. Every boarding gate featured prominent displays outlining passenger rights and company values. Flight attendants and gate agents had received intensive refresher training during the grounding. Most notably, every aircraft now carried an independent observer, a rotating position filled by trained professionals from outside the company, responsible for monitoring crew-passenger interactions and ensuring compliance with the new standards. The most visible symbol of change, however, was the Davis pin, a small silver emblem worn by all Pinnacle employees designed by Sophia herself. Its simple design featured two wings embracing a diverse array of symbols representing different backgrounds and identities. It's a daily reminder, Sophia explained to a reporter, that our job isn't just to transport people from one place to another. It's to create a space where everyone is treated with equal respect and dignity, no exceptions. For William Reynolds, the aftermath was devastating. The FAA investigation resulted in the suspension of his pilot's license pending a full review. Former colleagues distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. His reputation, built over 30 years, had collapsed in a matter of minutes. In a final blow, the Aviation Industries Professional Association revoked his membership, citing conduct unbecoming of an aviation professional and actions contrary to the safety and dignity of passengers. The man who had once declared himself God on this plane found himself grounded indefinitely. His career ended not by mechanical failure or weather conditions, but by his own prejudice and abuse of authority. The corporate revolution at Pinnacle Airways wasn't just changing one company, it was sending ripples throughout the entire industry. Competing airlines watched closely, some scrambling to implement their own versions of the Davis Initiative. Airport authorities established new passenger rights standards, and the FAA revised its guidance on captain authority to include explicit anti-discrimination provisions. But perhaps the most meaningful change was evident in the everyday experiences of passengers, particularly those who had historically faced discrimination while traveling. The anxious calculations of how to dress, speak, and behave to avoid unwanted scrutiny had been replaced by the simple expectation of being treated with dignity, regardless of appearance or background. As Dominic left the headquarters building that evening, he paused to observe a Pinnacle aircraft lifting off from the nearby airport. The company's redesigned livery gleamed in the setting sun, the same colors, but with the addition of the Davis pin symbol prominently displayed on the tail. His phone buzzed with the text from Zoe. Speech went well. Students, amazing. Dinner tonight. He smiled and replied, Wouldn't miss it. Proud of you. The transformation they had sparked together had extended far beyond one airline or one incident. It had challenged fundamental assumptions about authority, accountability, and inclusion in an industry that touched millions of lives daily. And it had begun with one simple, powerful act of refusal, a 17-year-old girl saying no to injustice, and a father ensuring that her voice was heard. The cavernous hangar at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport had been transformed for the evening. Where maintenance equipment normally stood, elegantly arranged seating faced a raised stage. The gleaming fuselage of a Pinnacle Airways Boeing 787, newly painted with the Ascend Academy insignia, served as a dramatic backdrop. Soft lighting cast the aircraft in a warm glow, symbolic of the evening's purpose to celebrate the first graduating class of the Bennett Foundation's flagship program. 200 guests filled the space, aviation executives, civil rights leaders, educators, and, most importantly, 20 young men and women in crisp navy blazers emblazoned with the Ascend Academy crest. Their faces reflected the diversity so long missing from aviation's upper echelons. Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous, all representing communities traditionally underrepresented in the industry. At the podium, Zoe Bennett stood poised and confident. At 18, she had grown into her role as the Foundation's public face. Her quiet dignity now complemented by a powerful speaking presence. The audience fell silent as she began. A year ago, she said, her clear voice filling the hangar on a plane just like this one, a man drew a line. He decided who belonged and who didn't. He decided his power gave him the right to judge, to exclude, and to humiliate. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. He thought he was defending his world. But his world was small, and it was fragile, and it was built on fear. What he failed to understand is that the sky doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to everyone. It is the great connector, the place of infinite possibility. Zoe gestured to the Ascend Academy graduates seated in the front row. The real power isn't in keeping people out. It's in lifting people up. That's what we are doing today. We aren't just launching careers. We are launching a new idea of what it means to ascend together. Applause echoed through the cavernous space. In the front row, Dominic Bennett watched his daughter with undisguised pride. Beside him sat Sophia Davis, Miguel Ramirez Doctor, Thomas Wilson, Gabriela Hernandez, and other key figures from the Flight 721 incident. a deliberate choice to honor those whose courage had catalyzed change. As Zoe continued her speech detailing the accomplishments of the inaugural class and their secured positions with airlines and aerospace companies across the country, a small television played silently in the break room of a trucking dispatch office across town. William Reynolds paused by the screen, a foam coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, as he recognized the young woman at the podium. The news ticker identified her as Zoe Bennett, founder of Ascend Academy, speaking at a ceremony celebrating aviation diversity. Behind her, the Pinnacle Airways aircraft gleamed, the airline he had once called home, now thriving without him. For a moment he stood transfixed, watching this confident young leader, the same girl he had tried to remove from his aircraft a year ago. The world had indeed moved on without him. The industry he had loved was now being shaped by the very person he had tried to cast out. Reynolds didn't say a word. He simply turned away from the screen, picked up his headset, and disappeared back into the anonymous drone of his new life, forever grounded while others soared. Back at the ceremony, Zoe was introducing the Academy graduates one by one, each standing to applause as she highlighted their achievements and future positions. Their faces shone with pride and purpose, representing not just personal triumph, but a fundamental shift in what was possible. As the formal presentation concluded, the hangar transformed for the reception. The Ascend Academy graduates mingled with aviation executives, many engaged in animated conversations about innovations and opportunities. These weren't just symbolic hires or diversity statistics. They were emerging leaders bringing fresh perspectives to an industry in transformation. Dominic found Zoe near the aircraft, deep in conversation with a young woman who had just accepted a position as a flight engineer with a major manufacturer. "I'm so proud of you," he said when they finished embracing his daughter. "Not just for what you've built, but for who you've become through all of this." Zoe smiled, glancing around at the gathering. It was never just about that one flight, was it? No, Dominic agreed. That was just the catalyst. What matters is what follows the change that lasts beyond the headlines. Sophia Davis approached them now, carrying herself with the confidence of an executive rather than the careful deference of cabin crew. "The Davis Initiative Quarterly Report is ready for review," she told Dominic. "Continuation of positive trends across all metrics." "Excellent," Dominic nodded. "Though I think we can officially stop calling it the Davis Initiative now. You've more than earned the recognition, but the principles have become part of Pinnacle's DNA." Sophia shook her head firmly. "The name stays, not for me, but as a reminder that speaking up matters, that one person refusing to participate in discrimination can change everything." Their conversation was interrupted by Miguel Ramirez, who approached with an industry publication in hand. "Have you seen this?" he asked, offering the magazine to Dominic. The cover story featured the transformation of Pinnacle Airways with the headline, "The Bennett Revolution: How One Incident Reshaped an Industry." Dominic skimmed the article with a thoughtful expression. "They're giving me too much credit. This was never about one person's decision. No." Zoe agreed it was about all of us making choices. You, Sophia, Miguel, Dr. Wilson, the passengers who stood up, even Captain Reynolds in his way. Every choice matters. As the evening continued, Dr. Wilson found himself in conversation with Eliza Montgomery, now firmly established as one of the most respected CEOs in the industry. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've spent my career studying moments of moral courage in history, those pivotal instances when people choose dignity over convenience, justice over compliance. What happened on Flight 721 belongs in that tradition." Eliza nodded. "The remarkable thing is how quickly it cascaded from one young woman's refusal to accept discrimination to a father's decisive action to an entire company's transformation, and now to industry-wide change." "That's how progress often works," Wilson replied. "Not through gradual evolution, but through moments of clarity, when we collectively decide that the old way is simply no longer acceptable. As the celebration wound down, Zoe stepped outside the hangar for a moment of quiet reflection. The night sky above was clear and star-filled aircraft lights tracing paths across the darkness. She thought about her journey over the past year, from the quiet, observant girl in seat 12B to the founder of a program changing lives and transforming an industry. The incident on Flight 721 had never been just about her, or even just about Pinnacle Airways. It had been about challenging the fundamental assumption that power gave some people the right to diminish others, about insisting that dignity wasn't a privilege but a right. Dominic joined her outside, standing quietly beside her as they both gazed upward. "What are you thinking?" he asked after a moment. "I'm thinking about connections," Zoe replied. "About how the sky links us all, how planes bring people together across every kind of distance. That's what makes what happened on that flight so wrong, using something meant to connect people as a tool to divide them instead." Dominic nodded thoughtfully. "And that's what makes what you've built so powerful, using that same technology to create opportunity to ensure that the future of flight reflects all of us." Inside the hangar, the Ascend Academy graduates gathered for a final photograph in front of the aircraft, their faces bright with purpose and possibility. They represented not just the future of aviation, but a future where belonging wasn't determined by appearance or background, where authority came with accountability, and where progress was measured not just in miles flown or profits earned, but in dignity preserved. The transformation that had begun with one girl's quiet no and one father's decisive action had expanded beyond them, beyond Pinnacle Airways, beyond even the aviation industry. It had become a template for how courage and clarity could transform institutions that had long seemed immovable. As Zoe rejoined the celebration, moving among the graduates with words of encouragement and connection, she embodied the principle that had guided her from the beginning. True power wasn't found in exclusion, but in elevation, not in keeping people out, but in lifting them up. And in that understanding lay the difference between those who merely occupied positions of authority and those who truly led, the recognition that the highest use of power was not self-preservation, but transformation. When Zoe Bennett refused to leave her seat on Pinnacle Airways Flight 721, she couldn't have known that her quiet dignity would spark a revolution that transformed an entire industry. Her simple act of refusing to accept injustice, backed by her father's decisive intervention, didn't just ground an airline for 3 days. It grounded outdated attitudes and soared beyond discrimination's limited horizons. 1 year later, the echoes of that moment continue to resonate in the Davis Initiative that has become the gold standard for accountability in the young Ascend Academy graduates, bringing fresh perspectives to aviation, and in the thousands of passengers who now travel with the simple expectation of being treated with dignity, regardless of who they are. The story of Flight 721 reminds us that no one is too powerful to face consequences, and no voice too quiet to spark change. When we choose to stand or remain seated for what's right, we create ripples that transform not just moments but movements. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of courage and transformation, and join our community of people who believe in the power of standing up for what's right. Remember, change doesn't require a position of power, it only requires the courage to say no when faced with injustice. Your voice matters more than you know.